Hey there guys, it's Metro, and we got a little bit of like a breaking news type thing coming at you here. This is a leaked list, quote unquote, of the new dungeons for Season 3. I want to give you my thoughts on it. It's been like one of the most commonly asked questions since this happened. Before we talk about it, I will say a few things about it. I don't know a single thing about who leaked this, where it even got leaked. Somebody just sent me this. I don't know why it's an image like this. I don't know anything about it, like where this info came from, who the person who claimingly leaked it is. But when it got brought up on stream, people that I trust told me that it was leaked by the same guy who did the same leak in Season 2 and apparently got every single dungeon right other than Vortex Pinnacle, which isn't that crazy considering 4 of them we already knew. But that's pretty crazy. So we got 3 out of the 4 other dungeons right. But one way or the other, there's been a lot of talk about dungeons for Season 3, so this will also be a discussion wrapped into what I would like to see for Season 3. So if these are them, these are terrible. These are the worst dungeons you could possibly imagine. And the main reason I don't think this is legit is because there's only going to be 2 2 Dragonflight dungeons, and they're both the Mega Dungeon, which is a huge misstep in my eyes. I think this would be a terrible idea. I feel like the Dragonflight dungeons are being received extremely well. In Season 1, I don't think a lot of people loved Ruby Life Pools and Not Good, but you know, the other 2 were very good in my eyes. And now again in, especially Algathar, everybody loves that. And now again in Season 2, I feel like all 4 Dragonflight dungeons are very good. There's not any one that I don't like. So it's disappointing to think that they would just not use those dungeons again and then go with these dungeons instead, because I don't know. But it's actually not that surprising to me because Blizzard has this thing up there, in their head that they're trying to we don't want people to feel like they're missing out. You know what I mean? Like that each season is different and that you don't feel like you missed out progression wise in the previous season, which for a year I was like, that's a terrible idea. It's a terrible mindset. But at this point, you can't really fight it, and it's working. It's fine. I don't like having all new dungeons every season. But the question is what actually happens moving forward then? Is there actually going to be a Season 4? We talk about this in a video that's now upcoming about what 11.0 might look like. But yeah, maybe this confirms that there will not be a Season 4 if they're doing this now then. Faxy's idea, other people talking about this, the idea was to have the 2 mega dungeons and then 2 voted for dungeons in Dragonflight, and I thought that was a great idea. So anyway, here's the ones. We got King's Rest, obviously the Dawn of the Infinite. I have not done it yet, so I have no idea how it's going to be broken up, which one's going to be harder, if there's a lot of trash in one. That's pretty common for some reason. The mega dungeon, the lower half always has way more trash than the upper half. Well, not necessarily in Tazavesh, I guess, but anyway, you guys can tell me what you think of those 2 dungeons as Mythic Plus. But the rest we've already seen. There's one exception, and that's Grim Batol. Let's just talk about Grim Batol first, because that is an absolutely horrendous idea to add that as a Mythic Plus. Vortex Pinnacle is no winner either, but at least it doesn't have this stupid gimmick where you can kill all the trash. I hope that they just remove that. That needs to just be removed. Because that is going to be you're just going to start the key, and if somebody doesn't do a good job with the Drake, it's a disband, right? Because that, I don't know how that works for count. I really, really hope this dungeon does not have it. And again, terrible checkpoints. You literally respawn at the start of the dungeon when you do this back in the day. Bunch of really, really long, pointless hallways. I get it. It's meant to be like Ironforge, a major dwarf city that's just infested with enemies. So, the lore kind of dictates the way it looks, but it's not a very good dungeon, period, let alone a Mythic Plus. And yeah, and then you have your famous little bridge thing that people fall off all the time. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be the worst dungeon they have in 3 seasons. And unless they majorly change it or it gets the Grimrail treatment where it just ends up being the easiest key of the season and everybody loves it. So who knows? I really don't want to see that dungeon. That's the number 1 offender in here, but all these other ones suck, and I'm going to tell you why. King's Rest probably the least offensive of all of these. King's Rest, good dungeon. I like the dungeon. It has Gatiku, which is one of my favorite items, obviously. So finally a good DPS weapon. from 5 mans for two-handed users. But that dungeon is historically really imbalanced, especially on Fortified Week. The Shadow of Zul was completely unfair, and to the point that like pretty much anything but Blood DK had like almost no chance of surviving it. It was like a huge amount of magic damage, and there was like no real way to deal with it. So we'll see how it plays out now with the new situation with tanking and all the talents and stuff, but that dungeon is very imbalanced, and it's a straight line like dungeon that you need less count than the straight line offers you, which I always hate about those. At least like in a dungeon like Uldaman, there's actually some options to skip, some options to play around. That is not how King's Rest works at all. There's nothing you can skip, at least currently, without using an invis pot. So that really, I don't like that at all. But it's a good dungeon. Like mechanically, last boss very challenging, very interesting fight, and it's got some really good gear for Blood DK. So we'll see what happens. Siege of Bralis, probably number 2 on my top 5 least favorite dungeons ever. But that was mostly because of fixes. Back then, bolstering and sanguine and some of the fixes in general were just super unfair in that dungeon. Bolstering especially because everything bolstered back in the day, and there'd basically be like 5 non-elites and 1 elite in every pack in the beginning of the dungeon. That was particularly problematic too then when it came out that you could actually bolster one of the mobs to infinity and use its like trash damaging mechanic to just kill everything else in the dungeon. So you'd be like kiting this mechanic around the whole dungeon. It was so boring, a terrible mechanic, horrible for pugging. It was just a really, 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 really bad dungeon, and made worse by the fact that there's a different version of it for Horde and Alliance. The Alliance version is actually just worse than the Horde version, which makes me wonder how they're going to handle that, because that's not going to work, especially not with cross-faction stuff. In fact, if you asked me a year ago, would we ever see Siege of Bralis, I'd be like, no, that's the one dungeon we definitely won't ever see, because it is got 2 different versions, and now you have the Horde and Alliance playing together. So I don't know what's going to happen there. They're going to have to basically change the dungeon, and why? Just don't do that dumb dungeon. Seat of the Triumvirate is probably one that I think a lot of people are going to immediately look at and be like, I don't want to do that dungeon, but that dungeon is probably actually going to be probably the most liked out of all of these. It's huge, it's wide open. We'll see what they do with count. But it's super wide open, and it's got a lot of really high volume pulls, which people love. Just like Brackenhide, we said the same thing. People hated Brackenhide before they played it, and now they love it. And usually a dungeon like that ends up getting tuned on the lighter side because it's so wide open, you kind of can't tune it to be tight, and you end up with good dungeon mechanics. The reason everybody hated it in Legion is because it was basically a BFA Mythic Plus in Legion, meaning very hard bosses, or like very hard trash, just like heavy mechanics throughout all the content, right? So very much more difficult than the Legion dungeons, and it was added late, so a lot of people didn't have as much time to learn it. But I have some really good memories in that dungeon, and the biggest problem with that dungeon for me was actually Necrotic, which is long gone. So I'm really happy to see that one again. That one is one that I think will actually be enjoyable, even though it's probably going to still be really hard. I don't really remember a lot of the difficulty of the encounters. I do remember that first boss being really, really dumb. So we'll see what happens. Talked about Grimmer Toll, terrible dungeon. Everbloom, one of my favorite dungeons ever, but because of a bug or quote unquote, like there's 2 little things that you can do in this dungeon. One, you can basically skip the whole dungeon because of this like little weird thing that you could jump on. Apparently they fixed that. People tell me that when they do it in the time walking version, you cannot do this jump anymore. But I wouldn't be surprised with evokers, being everywhere now, that there will be some new way to do this skip. So expect to learn it. But the other main thing that I loved about this dungeon back in the day was Dark Simulacrum. If you never played WoD challenge modes, Dark Simulacrum was probably the coolest spell that ever existed, and simultaneously the most broken and overpowered spell that ever existed. And the way challenge mode scaled, basically like these mechanics would hit you so hard that you would be able to basically spell reflect the boss and just kill it. Like you would put a dot from these bosses on the bosses and you would solo the boss. As a Death Knight, Blood Death Knight, I can Dark Simulacrum the caster boss, especially. I think it was actually just that one. I think there was something on the end boss too, maybe, but Anyway, yeah, Dark Simulacrum, that caster boss, put the debuff back on the caster boss, it dies. Like, straight up. You would one-shot the boss, basically. It would take a while to die, but you would kill the boss on your own with it. So anyway, that one is very fun, but there's no chance any of that stuff is going to continue. So we end up with a very difficult dungeon. The stuff that got skipped on the right side is like really pesky, difficult caster trash, large, kind of like medium volume. I think it's going to be kind of a mess, that side. And frankly, I've never gotten that. Like, I don't remember anything about it. So I'm not necessarily looking forward to Everbloom. But if you were asking me what would be the best Warlords of Draenor dungeon, I would say Everbloom. There's really no other dungeon that I would think is as good for Mythic Plus now as Everbloom. So we'll see what it looks like. There's a lot of weird stuff going on in that dungeon. And then Shadowpan Monastery, definitely the worst Mythic Plus dungeon from MoP. Not necessarily because of mechanics or anything else, just because at the time, in order to do it properly, you had to do a ridiculous skip. You had to skip almost like half the dungeon in the beginning, in the middle. You would ride your mount, and it required a warlock. That's part of the reason why I didn't like it. So you would mount up, soulstone the healer, and run from one side of the dungeon to the other. Control wipe, battle res, taken. Back then it wasn't a battle res, I don't think. But anyway, regardless, soulstone, res the healer, proceed with the dungeon. And that could easily change. Obviously, they can just change the count. The other weird thing about this dungeon, though, is in challenge mode, there was this requirement to click these corpses, okay? Now, I have no idea why that was a requirement in the first place, but I think this was from a day when they didn't really have count properly. Like, if you remember MoP, and I think also WoD challenge mode, there was no count. It was just enemies. So you'd have to kill like 15 enemies, and then there'd be other requirements to finish the dungeon. And one of them was to click these corpses 3 times. Sounds benign enough, but common bug in this game, if everybody clicks it at the same time, you get credit more than once. And if you didn't do this, you were in serious trouble. There was another corpse that you could use, but if you failed it there too, you're screwed. Because that really hard pack before the last boss was like, I don't even think about pulling that kind of pack. Or, well, anyway, I can't exactly remember which pulls were hard and which weren't, but I know that it was crucial to success, those 2 things, and they were very finicky. The dungeon itself, I really don't like the bosses of. Like, straight up hate the bosses of. But we'll see how it plays out. This is not the worst dungeon. And I will tell you, I've expected this dungeon the whole time, because they actually talked about Shadowpan Monastery in Season 4 of Shadowlands when they were talking about bringing back old dungeons from MoP. So we'll see what happens. This is the leak. This is terrible. Maybe if we talk about it enough, Blizzard's in the business of giving people what they want nowadays. I do not want Grim Patrol. That's the number. If this guy's wrong about one dungeon, I just pray it's Grim Patrol. The other ones, at Siege of Bralis, really. But there's so many good dungeons, man. Like, what, there's Motherlode, there's Eye of Azhar. Dungeons with, like, large volume, interesting mechanics, interesting encounters. Not Siege of Bralis, man. That last boss is so stupid. It's such a bad dungeon. And same thing with Grim Patrol. Let's see what happens, man. Let me know what you guys think about these 8 dungeons. Do you think it's real? Do you think it's illegitimate? The only reason I even think it's legitimate is because apparently the same guy who posted Season 2 and was right is posting this one. So I don't know how this guy's doing that, but that's not a good idea career-wise. So thank you for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.